It all began on a sunny afternoon when I decided to hang my laundry outside in the backyard. The weather was perfect, and the warm breeze reminded me of how my grandmother used to hang her clothes on the line back when I was a kid. It wasn't just about saving money on the dryer. It was about the simple joy of letting the sun do its work. I didn't think much of it until a few days later, when I opened my mailbox and found a crisp white envelope with the HOA logo printed across the top. I knew immediately it wasn't going to be good news. Inside was a fine notice, $100 for violating community aesthetics by hanging laundry outside. At first, I laughed. I thought it had to be a joke. Who in their right mind finds someone for drying clothes in their own backyard? But no, they were dead serious. The letter warned me that if I didn't remove the clothesline immediately, more fines would follow, and legal action could be taken. The next week, I noticed whispers among my neighbors. Some gave me sympathetic looks, while others avoided eye contact altogether. A couple of them quietly admitted they wished they could hang their laundry out too. But they didn't dare cross the HOA. That was the first time I realized just how much power this board thought it had. I decided not to take down the line. Instead, I doubled down. I hung more laundry. Shirts, jeans, towels, even my bedsheets fluttered in the wind like a silent protest. Each time I walked outside and saw them swaying, I felt a mix of pride and defiance. The fines kept coming. First, $100, then $250, then $500. They thought they could intimidate me, but they underestimated how stubborn I could be. At night, I'd sit on my porch swing with a cup of coffee and stare at those papers, vowing I wouldn't let them win. Then came the HOA meeting. I showed up with the latest fine notice in hand, ready to confront them. The president, a sharp-dressed woman with an ever-present scowl, immediately called me out. "You're in violation," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're lowering the property values by making the neighborhood look unkempt." I couldn't believe my ears. Laundry? Unkempt. I stood and addressed the room. "What's really lowering this community's value?" I said. "It's an HOA that bullies its residents over something so basic as drying clothes in the sun." Some neighbors clapped quietly. Others just looked scared. The board wasn't moved. They doubled down, warning me that the next step would be legal action. That night, I sat in my kitchen staring at the stack of fine notices and thinking about what to do next. I had two options: back down and let them control me, or fight back and risk it all. And something deep inside told me this wasn't just about laundry anymore. This was about freedom, rights, and standing up against an overreaching board that thought they could dictate every detail of people's lives. So, I made my choice. This was going to be a battle. The morning after that HOA meeting, I woke up with a fire in my chest. I had barely slept, tossing and turning, replaying their smug expressions in my head. That president, with her sharp suit and sharper tongue, thought she could scare me into submission. No way. I brewed my coffee extra strong and pulled out my laptop. If they wanted to play this game, I was going to play smarter. I started researching homeowners' rights, HOA contracts, and, most importantly, state laws. Hours turned into days, and I found myself swimming in legal documents, court cases, and forums where frustrated homeowners vented their stories. I realized something huge. This wasn't just about me. HOAs across the country had been fining people for the same thing, hanging laundry outside. There was even a phrase for it: right to dry. Some states had already passed laws protecting homeowners, recognizing that banning clotheslines was outdated, wasteful, and even environmentally harmful. But my state? Nope. Here, the HOA held all the cards, and they were playing a stacked deck that gave me an idea. What if I took this beyond just fighting my fines What if I fought for everyone who is too scared or too beaten down to stand up? The next HOA fine notice arrived, this one for $1,000. I pinned it on my fridge like a trophy. Instead of feeling crushed, I felt energized. This was fuel for the fight. I called an attorney. He listened carefully as I explained everything, from the first fine to the meeting where they tried to shame me in front of my neighbors. He leaned back in his chair, tapped his pen, and said, "This isn't just a case about you. This could set precedent." That word precedent code in my head. It meant that my battle could ripple out and affect thousands of people. But the HOA wasn't going to roll over. The very next week, they showed up at my house with a formal cease and desist order. The president smirked as she handed it to me. "You're only making this worse for yourself," she said. I looked her dead in the eyes and replied, "No, I'm making it better for everyone else." Neighbors started noticing. At first, they whispered. Then slowly, they spoke out. Mrs. Johnson, sweet retired teacher who lived 2 doors down, told me she used to love hanging her quilts outside, but stopped after the HOA threatened her years ago. A young family admitted they'd been fined for having a kiddie pool in their backyard, something that still infuriated them. One by one, stories poured in. And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. We began meeting in my garage. I turned it into a war room, pinning notices, letters, and research onto the walls. It felt like a grassroots movement. My neighbors, who were once too scared to confront the HOA, were now brainstorming strategies, writing letters, and pooling money for legal fees. When the HOA found out, they panicked. They sent security to monitor my house, trying to intimidate us. But the more they pushed, the stronger our resolve became. The lawsuit was filed, and the HOA board went into meltdown. They weren't just fighting me anymore. They were fighting an entire neighborhood. And soon, thanks to the local news picking up the story, they were fighting against public opinion too. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the smell of barbecues drifted across backyards, I stood on my porch and watched kids play while laundry swayed proudly on clotheslines up and down the street. It was like the neighborhood had rediscovered something it had lost: freedom. But the real battle hadn't even started. The courtroom was waiting, and the HOA had their lawyers locked and loaded. I knew they'd throw everything they had at me. Still, I wasn't scared. Because for the first time, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for everyone. And if the HOA thought I was going to back down, they had no idea just how far I was willing to go. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper. It's the kind of place where history had been written 1,000 times before. As I walked through those double doors, file folder in hand, I felt like I was stepping into a different world. This wasn't about backyard swings or porch plants anymore. This was the law. And I was up against an HOA with deep pockets and attorneys who thrived on intimidation. Their lawyer was already there, a tall man in a slick gray suit with a smirk that said he thought this case was beneath him. He barely looked at me, just whispered something to the HOA president sitting beside him. She was dressed like she was attending a corporate gala, pearls around her neck, glaring at me like I was a criminal. But I had something they didn't: truth, and a growing number of neighbors who weren't afraid to show up and support me. The judge, an older man with stern eyes, called the room to order. Case number 4521. The Homeowners Association versus. He paused, looking at the file. Mr. Adams. That was me. The HOA's lawyer went first, of course. He stood tall, his voice booming as he described how I had willfully violated community regulations and created an eyesore that devalued neighborhood property. He held up photos of my laundry swaying in the breeze like they were evidence of a crime. When it was my turn, I didn't try to match his theatrics. I simply told the truth. I explained how the fine started, how they escalated, and how the HOA tried to intimidate me into submission. I showed the judge examples of states that had already passed right-to-dry laws. I explained the environmental benefits, the cost savings, the sheer common sense of it all. And then I did something the HOA never expected. I brought witnesses. One by one, a neighbor stepped up. Mrs. Johnson talked about how she had been too scared to hang her quilts. A young mom explained how the HOA made her take down her clothesline even though her electric bills were crushing her family. Another neighbor admitted that the board had bullied him into silence for years. The courtroom shifted. You could feel it. What started as the HOA versus me was quickly becoming the HOA versus the entire community. The HOA president squirmed in her seat, whispering furiously to her lawyer. He tried to object, claiming none of this was relevant, but the judge overruled him. He wanted to hear it all. And then my attorney stood. He had saved the best for last. He held up the HOA's own bylaws and pointed out a clause buried deep inside. The board was not allowed to enforce rules that directly contradicted state or federal law. The catch, while my state hadn't passed a right-to-dry law yet, there was a growing push in the legislature, and my case could be the spark that tipped the scales. The HOA lawyer tried to spin it, saying, "Your Honor, this is about maintaining property values. Our community has standards, and Mr. Adams knowingly defied them." But my attorney leaned in and said, "Your Honor, this is about control. This board doesn't care about property values. They care about power. And my client isn't just fighting for his laundry line. He's fighting for the rights of every homeowner who has been silenced by overreaching HOAs." The judge sat back, tapping his gavel against the bench thoughtfully. "I'll need time to consider the arguments. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks." As we left the courthouse, the HOA president stormed past me without a word. But I caught the look in her eyes. It wasn't confidence anymore. It was fear. Outside, reporters swarmed. Someone had tipped them off, and now cameras were flashing. Microphones were shoved in my face. "Why are you doing this? Is this really just about laundry?" I looked into the cameras and said, "It started with laundry. But it's about so much more than that now. This is about freedom, fairness, and standing up when people abuse their power." That night, as I sat on my porch, my phone buzzed nonstop. Neighbors, strangers from other states, even environmental groups were reaching out, offering support. My fight had gone from a local dispute to something much bigger. The HOA thought they could crush me with fines and fear. But now, they had a war on their hands. 2 weeks later, I was back in that courtroom. This time, the benches were packed. Neighbors, activists, even reporters from the local news stations filled every seat. What had started as one man's battle against ridiculous fines had become a fight that everyone wanted to see play out. The HOA showed up with twice as many lawyers as before. They carried in binders, boxes of files, and walked with that smug air of certainty that money can buy. Their president sat at the center of it all, pearls shining lips pressed into a thin, determined smile. She thought today would be the day she'd finally bury me. The judge opened the session with a sharp rap of the gavel. "We are here to conclude case number 4521. The HOA's lead attorney stood first. He tried everything statistics, emotional appeals, even pointing to glossy brochures about community standards. He said that hanging laundry made the neighborhood look poor and lowered values. He painted me as reckless, stubborn, and unwilling to follow simple rules. When it was our turn, my attorney didn't waste time. He called me to the stand again, and this time brought evidence that changed everything. I pulled out my utility bills before and after. I started using the clothesline. Hundreds saved. Then I showed reports from environmental organizations that promoted outdoor drying as eco-friendly and sustainable. Finally, I revealed letters, dozens of them from residents all over the state who had been fined, bullied, or threatened by their HOAs for doing the same thing. I did. The courtroom was silent as the judge flipped through the stack of letters. Then came the twist. My lawyer had uncovered financial records through discovery. Records that showed the HOA was using fine money not for community upkeep, but for perks, expensive dinners, retreats, even a luxury car lease for the president. Gasps filled the room. The HOA president turned pale, her lips twitching as the judge glared at her. The judge leaned forward. So not only were you enforcing an outdated, arguably unreasonable rule, but you were also misusing funds collected from homeowners. The HOA's lawyer stammered, "Your Honor, that's silence." The judge snapped. That moment turned the tide completely. The judge's tone shifted from neutral to downright scathing. He told the HOA their arguments were flimsy, rooted in vanity rather than necessity. Then he looked directly at me. "Double quotes, Mr. Adams. You're right. This case is bigger than your laundry. It's about whether HOAs should wield unchecked power over basic freedoms. This court rules in your favor." Cheers erupted from the benches. Neighbors clapped, reporters scribbled furiously. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. But the judge didn't stop there. He added something no one expected. "Furthermore, I am recommending that this case be brought to the state legislature. This is a matter of public interest." The HOA president's face was priceless, somewhere between horror and disbelief. She had walked into that courtroom thinking she could humiliate me. Instead, she walked out facing potential investigations, angry neighbors, and a reputation in shambles. As I stepped outside, cameras swarmed again. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Adams, how does it feel to win?" I smiled. It's not just my win. It's a win for everyone who's been pushed around by people who forgot what community really means. But deep down, I knew the fight wasn't over. The court ruling was huge, yes, but changing the law, that would be the real victory, and I was ready to take it all the way. Winning in court was huge, but it felt like only the beginning. The HOA had been embarrassed, their misuse of funds exposed, and their power chipped away. But as I stood in front of reporters that day, one thought kept running through my head. What about everyone else? Because the truth was, my state still didn't have a right to dry law, which meant that even though I had won my case, countless families in other neighborhoods could still be fined, bullied, or shamed into silence. I wasn't about to let that stand. Within a week, I was contacted by an environmental nonprofit. They had heard about my case and wanted to partner with me to push for legislation. "You've got the story," one of their directors told me. "You've got the face for this fight. People listen when it's personal." So I went from being a guy who just wanted to hang laundry in peace to someone testifying at the state Capitol. I'll never forget walking into that grand chamber, the marble floors echoing under my shoes. Seeing lawmakers flipping through my case file. When I was called to speak, I told them everything. How my HOA fined me thousands. How they threatened me with legal action. How neighbors had been silenced for years. And how a simple act, hanging clothes to dry, had turned into a battle for dignity and fairness. Lawmakers leaned forward, nodding, some even shaking their heads in disbelief. One representative whispered to another, "They fined you how much?" I could tell the story hit them hard. Then neighbors joined me. Mrs. Johnson held up one of her hand-sewn quilts and said she hadn't dared hang it outside for a decade. A young mom told them about choosing between her electric bill and groceries. A college student pointed out the absurdity of being fined for saving energy. The room shifted. This wasn't politics anymore. Was people, and then came the hammer. My attorney presented evidence of other states that had already passed right-to-dry laws. He showed statistics on energy savings, environmental benefits, and how property values had not dropped 1 cent in those places. The lawmakers had no comeback. They knew what needed to be done. The vote came weeks later. I was sitting in the gallery, hands clasped, heart pounding. When the results were read overwhelmingly in favor of passing the right to dry, I felt tears sting my eyes. We had done it. It wasn't just my victory anymore. It was a victory for everyone in the state. No HOA could ever fine someone again for choosing to hang their laundry in the sun. Reporters rushed me after the session. "How does it feel to change the law?" one asked. I paused, looking out the window at the Capitol steps where my neighbors stood, waving and smiling. Some even holding little clothespins in the air, like symbols of our fight. "It feels," I said, "like freedom finally got its turn to dry in the sun." The HOA president, who started it all, she ended up resigning in disgrace after being investigated for financial misconduct. Her power trip was over. My neighbors, once afraid, now proudly hung their clothes outside. And my backyard clothesline. It wasn't just a rope and some clothespins anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest battles. From that day forward, whenever I saw shirts, quilts, and bed sheets swaying in the breeze across my neighborhood, I smiled. Because I knew I hadn't just stood up for myself. I had stood up for everyone, and all it took was refusing to back down. When they told me to take my laundry inside, asterisk. And that's how what started as a few clothes hanging in the sun turned into a legal battle that rewrote the rules for everyone. The HOA thought they could fine me into silence, but instead, they sparked a fight that reached far beyond my neighborhood. Sometimes the smallest acts of defiance, something as ordinary as drying your laundry, can stand for something much bigger. Now, every time I hang my clothes outside, I don't just see laundry swaying in the breeze. I see freedom, resilience, and a reminder that no rule is too small to challenge when it's wrong.